How often do you go through the pitch and you feel like it just doesn't hit? And you know the prospect has a need for what you're selling, you know it'll help them, but they just don't seem to register. And if they say anything at all, usually they won't. Usually they'll just hold it to themselves and tell you that they need to think about it or they need to run it by someone else. But if they do share what they genuinely think, they'll say something along the lines of, well, I don't really see the need for certain components. And the reason for this, you haven't opened the loop in their mind to have them realize that they have the need for said components. And it's your job as a salesperson to create a need within the prospect for the solution that you're selling. And the one size fits all pitch, hoping that they like it just enough to buy, it's usually not enough. And to understand this easily, pre-COVID, this might just be an Australian thing. I don't know if it's global, but pre-COVID in supermarkets and department stores, they'd have these stands and there'd be someone there cooking food and handing out samples, and always delicious, always smelled fantastic. And if you went into that store just after eating, you probably wouldn't be that interested because you're not hungry. But if you went into that store either looking for food or you were trying to rush through the shopping so that you can go and eat afterwards, you would smell that and you would probably go over and try a few samples. And most likely you would end up buying something that you never even considered. But prospects are no different. We need to make them hungry, but more importantly, make them hungry for specific things that we offer. So I'll share an example of something that I actually sold and how I did it. So I sold one program up until a couple of years ago. So I sold for them for a couple of years, and it was targeted at successful men who were 35 to 55, 60. And these were men that weren't showing up as they needed to be. And it could be as a father, as a husband, it could be as a leader, it could be showing up for themselves. But most of them were already quite successful running their own companies. So it wasn't like they were coming from a place of scarcity. It wasn't like they were coming from a place of, I don't have enough. But what they all had in common is no one held them to a standard, and no one had the ability to, because they built this wall, this facade around them to where no one could. But they came to us because they knew they needed change. But most of the time they were saying, I just need a nudge in the right direction. I just need someone to point me in the right direction. So if that's what we have as a starting point, let's contrast that with what the 3 pillars of the pitch were, and by extension, the 3 main features of the program. So the first was access. Now this was a pretty easy sell. So you would get access to the tools, the resources, the proven systems that will help move them in the right direction. Pretty straightforward. Then the second pillar, that was association. So you would get connected with other men in the same boat, other men who understand how you feel, other men on the same journey, and a lot of them, they've already done what it is you're looking to do. So that was pillar number 2. Then pillar number 3, that was accountability. And this wasn't just, we're going to check in with you once a week or once a fortnight. This was genuine, nowhere to hide kind of accountability. You had tasks to do every day, and if you didn't do it, there were penalties with absolutely nowhere to hide. But what I found, the problem with this is, think about the kind of successful guy that has done what he wants for years, often decades. No one's been able to question them. They have been at the top of the top of the top. Now imagine what would happen if I hadn't opened any loops, if I hadn't made them realize they have a need for those things. That's exactly what happened until I figured it out. They would say things along the lines of, I don't need anyone to hold my hand. I hold myself accountable. Why would I want that? Because they're building up all of these internal resistances as to why would I want someone to hold me accountable, especially to that level, because that's the anti-vision for them. And then association, I'm not interested in making friends. I came to you because I just need a nudge in the right direction. I just need you to give me some work, or honestly, just coach me. Go through a session. You tell me what I need to do. They were not problem aware. And they were the kind of guys, they didn't want to be told what to do. And in their minds, they built it up of, this is going to be some group therapy kind of thing. And I'm not interested in that. So there were two ways to go about it. I could have tried to objection handle them after and hope they understood. But if someone's already put up that level of resistance, if that is the type of prospect we're selling to, you can probably imagine how that would go. It would compound resistance and it would be very ineffective. So what I chose to do is actually look at, hey, what am I missing? What have I missed upstream so that I can make them hungry for these pillars? So what I would do is I would build the gap on the call like I usually do, and the gap between where they are now and where they want to be. And I would usually get them to kind of sit in it and realize the factors at play. And they can be some pretty serious things. And when we got down to it, it was things like losing their family, divorce, loneliness, and clarity on the regret that they were already feeling. Because some of these guys, they were on the brink of divorce. Maybe everything was about to fall apart. Maybe they realized it was a house of cards but didn't want to admit it. Whereas other guys, they might come to us after they lost their family 10 years ago chasing this big dream of a massive company, and they finally got the dream, but only to realize at that point, missed the purpose of life. And there's that sense of regret. But we would have to get them to this point where they had a realization, and they were very deep calls and usually quite uncomfortable for the prospect because, again, no one's held them to this standard. No one's questioned them like this for years, and they'd been hiding from themselves. But once they understood and accepted what was at play, I would start to open the loops. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen just for a second, and on there, I'll kind of map out in a system where these things actually connect. So I'll do that now. So what we have here, a super, super basic outline of a script. So we've got our intro, time check, agenda. This is what we're going to cover. This is where we could end up. Are you okay with that? Yep. Then we go through the discovery. Now, depending on the kind of prospect they are, sometimes you start with current, sometimes you start with success. Just depends on where the prospect is and how they think is a start point. Then we go through pre-handling objections. You can do this in a few different places. You can either do it after the discovery, as in building the gap in this section here. You can do it in here as well. But what I do most of the time is I pre-handle all of the big objections early on as part of the agenda. But that's a whole other video. Now, following that, here are the deliverables. So if we can actually draw a line here. So we go in. So we've got our pitch here. We have our 3 deliverables. 1, 2, 3. That 1 actually looks more like a 2. 1, 2, and 3. So as I said just before, access, pretty straightforward. They were kind of coming to us for access. Association is the next one. How do we make them realize they have a need for that? And then we've got accountability as well. So essentially what we do is you've got the deliverables section here. Just below that, we need to take each of these up here, but we don't pitch them on these deliverables before the pitch. That wouldn't make sense. But what we actually need to do is ask them questions before we get to the pitch to have them realize that they have a need for these, that they actually have a need for each of these deliverables. So what I'll do now, I'll switch this off and I'll go back and I'll show you essentially what I did in each section and how it works. Okay, so as I mentioned before, by the time we get to this point, they will have shared some pretty deep information. I will have made them realize what the genuine factors at play are, and then I would have to open the loops for the deliverables. And then the first one would be association. So keeping in mind, they had just shared some really deep information with me. And I'd ask the same question every time. when you speak to your close friends about this, what do they say? And almost without fail, every time they'd say, I don't have any close friends. And I'd always double down on it. I'd say, hey, did you just say that you don't have any close friends? And they'd say, yep. Then we'd sit in silence for a couple of seconds. And then I'd have to ask them about accountability. So directly on the back of that, I'd say, well, who holds you to a standard then? Who holds you accountable? And they'd always say, well, I hold myself accountable. No one else has tried to for years. Because they built up that wall around them. If anyone ever tried to hold them accountable, they'd push them away, dismiss them. And then I'd follow up with a question. I'd just say, you hold yourself accountable. They'd say, yep. And I'd just say, how do you think that's working out for you? And they'd say, not great. And then this was probably the sale question, or at least the one that tied it in a bow. Because by this point, they'd said what they wanted to do, what they wanted to be better at, and the reason why. So do you think and it'd be wife, kids, parents, whoever they said, do you think your wife, Sarah, would say you hold yourself to the standard required for you to, and then I'd insert, be a better father, be a better husband, be a better person, whatever they said. So do you think Sarah would say you hold yourself to a standard required to be the husband that you've just mapped out, the husband that does come home in a good mood, the husband that does spend time with the kids, the husband that does make her feel appreciated? Do you think Sarah would agree that you hold yourself to that standard? And say, no, I don't think so. Again, double down. You don't think so? No. And then another few seconds of silence. And then in that silence, I'd see how they'd react. And 95% of the time, you'd see them soften. You'd see them have the realization. You'd see that thinly veiled persona, that wall they'd put up around them, it had just come crumbling down. Because they thought that they were this, dominant alpha male who looked after himself and held himself accountable and held himself to a standard, when in actual fact, he just built up this big wall of insecurities around himself. And then I'd move on, because he already knew that he had no one around him that he could turn to. And he realized very clearly that he didn't hold himself to the standard that he thought, or the standard that he told himself he was. So 95% of the time, that'd go really well. 5% of the time, they'd screw up their face. These are the guys that really wanted to stick to it, the story they'd told themselves for years. And I would have to push them a little bit further on the point of, why would they even need to accept accountability? Because if they felt as though they held themselves to that standard, if they felt as though they were already there, then where do we come in? But the reason I did this here, one of two reasons. One, the majority of the time, even that last 5%, I would say a good 90% of those realized during that extra pressure test, those few layered of questions like, hey, I'm not what I thought I was. But then a very small portion of them would stick to it. They'd stick to the act. And with those people, I would very politely end the call and we would part as friends. Reason being, if they went into the program completely unable to accept accountability from someone else, that would ruin the experience for the other men in there. But again, these are minor details. So by this point, I've opened those loops. I've had them realize I need association, aka connection with other men. And I need accountability because I'm not doing what I've been telling myself I was doing. And they can clearly see they have gaps for those. Only then would I actually transition into the pitch. And I would connect it very, very clearly to everything that they'd said ahead of time. So by the time they find out that they're going to get access to the tools, that they are going to be surrounded by other men who've walked in their shoes, people that understand them, and that someone is going to hold them accountable. Someone's going to hold them to a standard so they can be the better husband that they've been promising Sarah that they'll be for the past 25 years. It's a breath of fresh air. It's a relief for them because they realize that they actually have a need for those things. But how do you actually apply this to your sales. What does that look like? So the first step is map out what the top 3 features of the program are, the top 3 deliverables. Now, you can usually see these in your pitch. What are the top 3 things that you talk about or uncover or work through in your pitch? But then which ones do you get pushback on? Which are the ones where they're like, not really relevant? Because those are the ones that you need to do more work upstream. Then you've got to ask yourself, does my questioning make the prospect does my questioning make the prospect realize that they have a need for those deliverables? The answer is usually no. And then the question, how can I ask them questions to make them hungry for those deliverables? How do I ask them questions to make them realize that they have a need for them? And one of my favorite questioning strategies across the board is just the assumptive question. So in this example, it was, when you speak to your close friends about this, what do they say? Or let's say you're selling trading. When you speak to other really successful traders in your network, the ones that are doing those 100, 150K months, what do they say you should do? I don't really have anyone. Okay. Fitness. When you speak to your other very active, very athletic friends, what do they say you should do here? Oh, I don't really have anyone I can turn to. Assumptive questions are a really easy way to start. Obviously, you've got to deliver them quite gently. Don't make them too accusatory, but a really good place to start. But that's enough for this video. Hopefully this is helpful, and I'm sure we'll unpack this a little bit further in future videos. Cheers.